the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion and our guest, we want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider joining that. We are offering access to our Discord server, and we have some additional content that's available, pardon me, from some reading groups we had been doing in the past. We're working on getting some new ones scheduled, just sorting out some difficulties with new jobs and new responsibilities. So bear with us, and we hope to have some reading groups coming soon there. But today we are pleased to be joined by Rocco Gangle, professor of philosophy at Endicott College. He's been on the show a couple of times now, and we're going to look at Leibniz's Monadology. So this should be fun, and welcome back to the show, Rocky.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me back. It's great to be here.
Rocky, do you have any encounters with Leibniz origin story stuff, or is this also more or less newer material for you today?
Well, I came to Leibniz through Spinoza.
Yeah.
And I still have a hard time reading Leibniz without seeing the ghost of Spinoza behind him, which I think was really there. I think Leibniz, he met Spinoza personally, and my sense is that was really a crucial turning point for him and his thought, because he was horrified by some of the consequences of Spinoza's system. And I'm not sure how much of that is necessarily baked into the monadology. But for me, when I first read Leibniz's work, I read it after working on Spinoza and saw it as being always in dialogue with Spinoza, which, yeah, is at least one way to look at it, I think.
Did they exchange letters? Do we know?
I don't think we have letters between them, but we know that Leibniz met with Spinoza for several days. It was like a more than one day. Like they spent significant 2 or 3 days together just before Spinoza died.
That's really interesting. I need to follow up on that biographical, just read. That would be interesting to read about. So that's,
I think he visited him at The Hague.
Okay.
But I don't think there's an actual record of the visit, but it was like 1676. Roughly.
Wow.
Yeah, that sounds right.
That fall.
And they had several friends in common. They knew Henry Oldenburg. They both, I think, corresponded with Schernhaus.
Okay.
People involved with the Royal Society. So there was a pretty tight-knit group of largely English thinkers, I think, like the Christian Platonists.
Okay.
And so both Spinoza and Leibniz were connected with them in various ways. So they certainly were running in the same circles.
And I actually didn't check. What's the date on this? Coop, you said 1676 was when he met with Spinoza. Do we have a date on the monadology? Was it like the early 1700s, or is that too late? I could look at my edition. Sorry, I should have.
1714 was the
1714. Okay.
Yeah. First published in German, written in French, interestingly. 1714, first published in German in 1720.
Okay.
It wasn't until 1840 that the original French version appeared.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's really, I had no idea.
And I read the tidbit that it wasn't translated into English until the 1870s, and that a lot of Leibniz's work didn't get translated into English until the 1890s. So it's at least maybe his philosophical work, but I know that he obviously published a lot and wrote a lot as well. But I think the monadology was the first to be translated, obviously because of its brevity. But yeah, so I think it's an interesting, belated run at translating a thinker who I guess was always more famous for his mathematical work and his formulation of the calculus and all of the symbols that we use today for that. But yeah, so a little bit of a late start in English for the translations. But if you guys are ready, we can dive into the text.
Yeah, let's jump into it.
There's a lot there, but with very little. I guess one thing for the readers to know, the monadology, you could read it in, like, I would suppose about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. You really take your time. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack, but it's 90, if you want to call them paragraphs. Some of them, like some of the first few are, they're numbered, and some of them are mere sentences. Others are a little bit longer paragraphs, but it can be a quick read.
It's like reading tweets almost.
Some of them
Yeah.
would definitely fit the tweet form. He would have to have blue Twitter to get some of the other propositions down. So I guess I would start with just asking, and this obviously is something to unpack and can't necessarily be done immediately, since we have to go through all the propositions, or at least a lot of them, to get more into this. But maybe we could start with the monad and describing some of its properties, since that seems to be one of the main reasons behind this. Obviously not the only one. So I guess I'll put you on the spot, Rocky. If I were to, let's say this is a philosophy 101 class and that kind of comes up, what are some of the salient features you might bring out in your reading to talk about the monad?
Yeah, I think in a way, it is a monadology. So in some sense, if we understand fully what a monad is, then we get the whole picture, right? Everything is ultimately, in Leibniz, a metaphysics of monads. I struggle with this idea. I think it's hard to take in everything that Leibniz says and make it make sense.
Yeah.
But at least at a starting point, we can be clear about what a monad is not. It is not a composite, so
Yes.
it has no parts, but it's also not an atom. So we have to avoid any association with Democritus, with atomism, where we would think of these monads as little tiny grains, even indivisible grains, right? So mathematical points.
Because he does say he doesn't want to equate it with points, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't he say that in one of the propositions? So that and I think by extension, that's why you're pointing out the monad would not be equivalent with the atom, correct?
And so somehow they have to be like atoms in the sense that they are simple substances, but they are like scholastic substantial forms in that they have qualities and they are individuated by the particular characteristics that qualify them. So somehow a monad has to be both, it has to do the work of a substantial form and the work of an atom without being either one of them.
Yeah. Now, not to derail this, I'm trying to actually add on. Would the term that Deleuze takes from Duns Scotus and likes, would something like hexaity be applicable to monads? Would that be a good, because I know Coop and I talked about hexaities, and we've been doing the read through of 1,000 Plateaus, and I felt like this is Leibniz's version of hexaities, or what Simondon calls singularities. Does that seem to correspond with your reading, Rocky, or is that going too far?
No, I think they're very close in spirit to hexaities, but I think the subtle, tricky difference is that for Scotus, hexaity is something like the last of the forms.
Okay.
And I think Scotus technically says it's not a substantial form, but for sure for Scotus it's not material. And hexaity, he doesn't want to individuate things with matter, so it's not exactly a form, but it works within the intellectual space of the forms. It functions like a last form that is so perfectly individuating that there can be only one. And the monads are like that, but I think Leibniz turns it around. So rather than being the last determination, a bunch of predicates, it's actually the substance. It's like the container for all of these predicates.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I think that's from a logical point of view. I think that's one of the interesting things that's happening with Leibniz is he's shifting from a metaphysics of substance and attributes to a logical metaphysics of subject and predicates.
Yes. Okay. Hence analysis, for example, being his, which comes up at least in one of the paragraphs later on, where he goes into what the different forms of truths, right? The contingent truths of fact and there's the other, which we can return to. But in any case, I know that like in Deleuze's seminars, when he plays Kant off of Leibniz and the a priori, the a posteriori, and he's saying we can always analyze further, break down, and find the predicate within the subject, etc. Right? But we don't need to go down that road. I was thinking about, okay, so yes, the other thing, I know that this is famous, and it's funny that it does come up in this early on in the monadology. One of the things that I'd always remembered is monads don't have any windows. And I always thought that was a funny thing, just a phrase taken out of context. But in the context in which he says them, monads are not susceptible to external causes, right? They change based on their internal principles. And I thought that was an interesting addition to what you're trying to lay out here with this substantial form argument.
Right. I think, there's some sense in which a monad is an infinite interiority without an exterior. And that's why I think that it's easy to read the monadology and think of the monads as being like points in space, because a lot of the imagery, a lot of the examples suggest that. But at least at a starting point, it's better to think of monads not as being individuals, but as being the only thing, the universe, because they have no relationship.
Okay, right.
There's no relationship to something outside. So a monad is the universe. A monad is everything.
Or it's like a plane.
Maximal.
Or it's like a plane of, I don't know. I was thinking, I couldn't figure out if it was like, would fit like a virtual plane or a actual plane, because there's some, I don't know, he contradicts himself to me in my reading a little bit, because the monads themselves are eternal. Right? They're not, I guess he implies that they can be created and annihilated, but they don't, there's a certain fixed aspect to them, even though because of the windowlessness, because of the lack of interaction that he posits between monads themselves, there is a certain fixed aspect externally, but obviously internally, there's infinite variation. There's infinite difference within the monads. So it's really strange, and I think really an inversion of Simondon, right? Because for Simondon, it's like there is nothing but relation, and that's how real change occurs. So he subtracts the kind of transcendent aspect of God unifying things and providing like the harmony of the universe with transduction, right? The transduction would be the reverse of Leibniz.
Of Leibniz's pre-established harmony.
Correct, yeah.
And you're right, Coop, about I think the adverb naturally does a lot of work in these first opening numbered propositions, because he says that they can't form naturally, they can't perish naturally, they can't begin naturally. And yet, as you said, he does bring up the possibility of creation, and I think the translation is annihilation, at least in the one I shared with you. So that might be dependent upon God, whom, if I recall correctly, and Rocky and Coop, you might be able to help me out here. Since Rocky, you were going with the monad as the universe, does he not call God a monad, or am I conflating things?
I think so, or at least he makes the claim that if a monad were to have only clear perceptions, that it would be a god.
Right.
So it sounds as if the only thing that distinguishes us as a monad, me, say, as a monad from God, is that I mostly have confused perceptions. So all of the data is there. I don't lack any of the data. It's just that the theater of perception remains highly constrained.
Limited, yes.
It somehow is associated with a body, right? That my monad is associated with my body, which is part of this material plenum. But just as the material plenum is one kind of big jelly, right? And I'm just one little piece of the jelly.
Yeah.
My monad extends all the way to the edges of the universe, right? So there's no lack of being, there's only lack of perceiving among the finite monads, the created monads.
Did you find something, Coop?
Yeah, I actually was going to maybe I'll read this because this kind of goes to a bit of what Rocky was saying a moment ago. Monads are not mathematical points, for these points are only extremities, and the line cannot be composed of points. Yet monads must have some qualities and some changes, otherwise they would not be beings at all. And if simple substances were non-entities, compounds would also be reduced to nothing. And if simple substances did not differ qualitatively, there would be no way of perceiving any change in things, since what is in the compound can only come from its simple constituents. And if monads were without different qualities, they would be indistinguishable from one another, since they do not differ quantitatively, sorry. And consequently, supposing the existence of the plenum, each plane would always receive in any motion only the equivalent of what it already had, and one state of things would be indistinguishable from another.
I guess I liked your way of describing the plenum, Rocky, as this jelly, because Leibniz does say that like every motion or every body in motion is affecting every other body at the same time, right? There's a kind of action at a distance type, almost quantum aspect to that supposition that he has. And I suppose the one thing would you click back? It was proposition 8. I just want to see, I wanted to ask what this might mean. When I corrected you, Coop, I'm sorry, but I was curious about this proposition that monads do not differ quantitatively, only qualitatively. Did you guys have anything maybe to say about that? Does this come to that scholastic difference or distinction that Deleuze brings up a lot of time between a numerical distinction and a formal, what is it? I'm sorry. Right,
like a real but non-numerical difference.
Okay, yes, right. I suppose I was just curious about monads don't differ quantitatively. I suppose then, is this having to do with his conception of infinity? Does this have to do with the nature of monads themselves, that it's not about number in any sense, right? It's merely about their internal qualitative principles?
See, this is the kind of thing that I struggle with, is I don't know how they could not be numerically distinct, because they function like souls.
Yes, right.
And so it just doesn't, I understand how matter can be continuous, but if monads are continuous, then what is individuated?
Interesting. Yeah.
But maybe the answer is much more kind of psychedelic, in that, and it explicitly talks about in matter, as you zoom in, like I think he was obsessed with the new microscopes.
Yeah.
As you zoom in, you get even smaller organisms, and each organism, presumably, if you zoomed in, he really is thinking of infinities of infinities. He's not an atomist, and so if you really take that picture seriously, this kind of fractal zoom metaphysics, that each monad is going to contain infinitely many monads somehow.
Yes.
They're going to be, so maybe they're not, the individuation of the monads is much weirder, because we don't have just a kind of, I tend to think of them as ping pong balls. Like a monad is a ping pong ball with a movie being projected on the interior, right? And it's a movie of the whole universe. But that can't be right. That can't be what they are, but it's hard to avoid that as the intuition. But I think the inoculation against that bad intuition, that bad picture, is that the ping pong ball can't have any volume, right? Or it's each point of the interior is like a funnel into other points or other ping pong balls, right? So maybe the monads are much more, I don't know, pre-individual. Maybe maybe that's the sort of thing that Deleuze picks up on or builds on.
Yeah, because I'm wondering, so he says that, right, bodies obviously have influence on one another, but the monads don't, which seems a bit weird. Or like, how do you square that away? It seems like the implication would be that there's some type of something else going on with reference to, like I was saying, like the plane of immanence or the plane of the virtual plane or something along those lines would be what the monads are almost like a field of potentials, but then again, they don't, if they're unchanging externally and only internally, right?
Right. And that's why Leibniz's solution to that is pre-established harmony. And I think in some sense, each monad is like a film reel that's just unspooling its perceptions, its images in a kind of bodiless mind. And it just happens to be the case, because God willed it so, that the movie that's running in your mind matches up with a bunch of events that are happening to your body. But the account is even less plausible than Descartes. Why does your body and your mind match up? At least Descartes gives us some kind of little piece of the brain. Like maybe there's a little antenna in the brain that does this. Whereas Leibniz is just saying they just match up because God willed it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Although it is interesting that he mentions Descartes and the dualism. He goes at Descartes about dualism here. I don't know if this one, let's see.
It might be later on.
I think it's this next. So he says Descartes recognized that souls cannot impart force to bodies because there is always the same quantity of force and matter. However, he believed that the soul could change the direction of bodies, but this is because the law of nature, which also affirms the conservation of this same total direction and matter, was not known in his day. If he had noticed this, he would have come across my system of pre-established harmony.
And then yeah. Yeah. And I like the next one too, number 81. The system means that bodies act as if there were no souls, although this is impossible, and souls act as if there were no bodies. And both act as if each influence the other. I like the as if structure there in that proposition.
Yeah, and this is a point where the contrast with Spinoza is interesting.
Okay.
Because after Descartes, everybody's wrestling with this dualism of matter and mind, or extended substance and thinking substance. And Spinoza posits one single order and connection of causes, which in the space of ideas becomes some kind of deductive framework of reasons. In the space of bodies becomes a bunch of mechanical interactions, right? However that is meant to work, it's one and the same order and connection of causes under two different attributes. And Leibniz ends up with the same result, but he has two separate sets of order and connection of cause.
Right.
It's just they act as if they were lining up with one another, and they happen to also actually be lining up with one another, but that's only occasionally true. Each one is mirroring the other, but not because of any mirroring relation. Each one is somehow indicating the other series, but only intrinsically. The bodies act as if they're rational. The minds act as if they're embodied. But those two ways of pointing to the other series or the other attribute don't have any kind of intrinsic connection other than God's recognition of its perfection or recognition of its harmony.
Yeah, there was a good way of, I think, maybe hitting upon what Leibniz is talking about with the pre-established harmony. And Coop, if you could pull this up, if you don't mind, in your docs, I think if I remember, in one passage, he refers to this pre-established harmony as following God's power, God's goodness, and God's will. So maybe look for goodness. That might be, let's see, that's about the moral order of the moral world, right?
I think it's in number 55.
Okay, there it is. Yes. And so this is the best of all possible worlds hypothesis, right? Which I assume would be another name for pre-established harmony. This is the cause of the existence of the best, which God's wisdom makes him know, his goodness makes him choose, and his power makes him produce. And what is 54? Just scroll up a little bit. I'm sorry. Fittingness, degrees of perfection, which each possible world having the right. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So this has always made me think about, that's like compossibility. And if I was thinking like Meillassoux with his kind of argument that, contingency is the universal. So if you can make that leap, I think here, like for Leibniz, it appears that this is the best of all possible worlds because of contingency, right? Because contingency, the universality of contingency means that not all outcomes are possible within a universe. So you could certainly look at that and say, okay, that does imply, in a sense, a type of harmonics in the universe, because everything is relying on, every variable is predicated on a prior causality or something like that. But I don't know, maybe that gets into a chain of causality, but I don't know. There's maybe the relations between, I don't even know. I don't even know what the relation between something. Between bodies? I don't know.
But you were hitting on it. He does say that there's an infinite series of causes that have a source, and that source being God, right? That's I guess number 48 says there is in God power, which is the source of everything, then knowledge, which contains the detail of ideas, and finally will, which brings about changes and products in accordance with the principle of the best. How do we feel about this optimism that Leibniz has of the best? Is that consequent on his theological convictions? Rocky, this might be a question for you with your theological background.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to hear what the two of you think about Leibniz's attempt to preserve freedom in God in coordination with the contingency of the world.
Right, yeah.
Because it seems very plausible to me to say that Leibniz's God is just as necessitarian as Spinoza's. Because given God's wisdom and goodness and power, God has to choose the best of all possible worlds. And I think Leibniz will disagree with that and will try to, I think, contort himself to say that in some sense, even though God will choose the best, he doesn't have to.
That's his
I'm
will.
curious
That's
what you
why.
make of that. Like, what degree of freedom is left if God is definitely going to do it? What is it? To what degree is the creation of the best world actually a free act of God rather than a necessitated result or consequence of God's nature?
Yeah, this is because here's 45. Thus, God alone, or the necessary being, which is funny because Coop just brought up Meillassoux, and Meillassoux' argument is that contingency is the only necessity. Anyway, God alone has this privilege that he must exist if he is possible. But the one I just read too, about 48, to go to your point, Rocky, it's Leibniz is saying it's his will that brings about changes in products in accordance with the principle of the best. So God wills it, but as you're saying, it does feel like he's already baked into the pre-established harmony that it's a necessity, which if God is the only necessary being, his necessity necessitates that his will follows a kind of rational pattern rather than having anything, as you said, any room for freedom in that sense. So the question of freedom is a big one, I think, and you hit upon it. And it hadn't occurred to me in reading this that gets to the heart of perhaps some of the difficulties. And it makes sense why the translation that Coop and I are looking at, and I think Leibniz himself too, is pointing back to the book he wrote 4 years earlier, the Theodicy, right? That there might be some more clues to follow up on this question there. Yeah.
It strikes me as similar to the problem of evil, or tackling that question for Christianity, as far as like, why would God allow evil or suffering to exist in the world, right? I think, and I'm wondering too, to what extent is this part of like maybe the social, how out of pocket would Leibniz been allowed to be with respect to making claims about God and theology at this time? And I wonder, maybe that's immaterial perhaps, but I don't know, just a question of like, how much of that is this pressure to not be considered a heretic, right? But also, yeah, I think the big implication would be the problem of evil in the world, right? And how do you explain that? You explain that because through contingency blocking some outcomes from happening. And the problem of freedom or free will also is implied there too.
Imperfections is what keeps monads from being God, as Rocky brought up. And that seems to be one of the trails to get to this question of evil for Leibniz. But you and I have talked about the question of evil for Spinoza and for Meillassoux. For Spinoza, and Rocky, I'm sure you study this way more than I have. In the little Spinoza book, the Practical Philosophy book, Deleuze spends a whole chapter on it when he's looking at the Bleinberg correspondence and how Spinoza treats evil as epiphenomenal, right? It doesn't have any substance or being, right? Whereas for Meillassoux, he's concocted this future God who does not yet exist, but will in the future, and therefore evil cannot be ascribed to him, and he will bring about justice in this last instance type phase. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that question of evil there, Rocky?
Yeah, I mean, I think Spinoza's notion of evil makes sense to me, which is that evil is relative to the essence of particular modes. And so there is no universal moral standard of evil that can be applied across the board. To be evil is just relative to some essence to tend towards the diminishing of the power of that essence. So poison is evil to me.
Yes.
But presumably there's some creature that can drink the poison and it makes them stronger and it's good for them.
It's very Nietzschean in that sense, right? Beyond good and evil, but not beyond good and bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you think about plants and animals, right? Like as far as carbon and oxygen, right? They're inverse poison for one another. Like we would die if we were inhaled nothing but carbon dioxide, right? Rather. Yeah. No, to go to your point. So that's interesting.
Whereas Leibniz does seem committed to a notion of moral goodness. And I think he wants there to be a kind of hyper perfection of goodness in God.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to make sense of that. That I really a revised Leibniz, and I think this is the Leibniz that captivated Bertrand Russell, who was very interested in Leibniz early on. A Leibniz without really any theology, where you think of metaphysics as being almost like someone like Stephen Wolfram, do you know Wolfram's idea of the Rouliad? It's an interesting idea. It's just like a kind of massive space of all possible formal systems. So think of every logical and mathematical universe. So every possible consistent formal way of making things operate on other things. So you have this just absolute infinite space of all possible possibilities that like totally unlimited system will generate its own kind of intrinsic convergence on some way of organizing itself through various higher order systems of the various systems. That logic or formalization somehow has a kind of inner gravity or tendency towards simplicity and a kind of harmonious balance between the economy of the rules, or let's say the economy of the axioms, and the generality and power of the theorems. And I love a picture of Leibniz where we basically say there are all of these weird compossibilities of individuals, different ways that individuals can be defined by compossible events. Then the individuals get self-organized into compossible worlds. But rather than saying God from the outside happens to select the one that is most perfect, the one that is most perfect is just intrinsically determined as the one that has this kind of maximum balance between economy of principles and maximality of variety or results.
I think that's the Simondon tie there, right? That's what I was thinking of too.
Well,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of the machinic assemblage type stuff that would resonate there too. I think with the emergence of order and what have you between bodies or whatever the fuck. I don't know how to articulate that, but
I was thinking of the rhizome, right? That we've been talking about it pretty much every plateau, and the rhizome in that introduction chapter, they describe it as they use that term from Rosenthal and Petitot, the mathematicians, and it's army without a general. It's a multiplicity of not n dimensions, but n-1 dimensions. What's subtracted is the transcendent instance, right? So God is subtracted. So like Deleuze's Leibniz too sounds very similar to what you're describing, Rocky, where he doesn't want to have a God preordaining the convergence and divergence of series, which for him is like stacking the deck. You're cheating a little bit. But that does also go to what was saying was how much of the theology is baked into the philosophy, given the times in which Leibniz was writing, where there was still, I'm sure Leibniz knew about Spinoza's excommunication, for example, right? So how much freedom does Leibniz have navigating this without dropping God out of the system?
Yeah, I think one thing that Simondon and Deleuze, and especially Guattari, have in common that's both Leibnizian and anti-Leibnizian is for all of them, subjectivity is emergent. And I really like that kind of picture, that subjectivity, even if we assume that the Leibnizian model is basically right, that subjectivity is a kind of closed theater of representation, that I think Simondon, and certainly Guattari, and I think probably Deleuze, would want to say that closure nonetheless is generated through some kind of instigation, some kind of emergence. And so subjectivity needs to be explained. It can't be a primitive of the metaphysics, which it certainly is in Leibniz. Leibniz starts with monads, which are little subjects, and then happens to have an account on the other side of matter. But there's no sense at all in which a monad comes to be on the basis of something that would occur materially.
Yeah, no, that's good. Even in his first book, Deleuze, I forget exactly the turn of phrase. I don't have the copy near me, but he talks about the question of knowing. It's not a question of knowing whether or not the subject is given. It's how the subject comes to be produced in the given, right? This is the question that he focuses on from the very first pages. And so it mirrors what you're describing here, Rocky. Let's see. I know that at the end of the book, just to cap off this discussion, he turns to this notion of the city of God as architect and legislator, this perfect government, even this notion of pure love. So, like 87 is interesting. As we have established above, a perfect harmony between the two natural kingdoms, the one of efficient causes the other final causes, we ought here to point out yet another harmony between the physical kingdom of nature and the moral kingdom of grace, that is between God as architect of the machine of the universe and God considered as monarch of the divine city of minds. I'm wondering with these last, I won't read more, starting around, I guess it's around 85, although obviously it builds on from some of this. But I'm wondering about the political implications of these last 5 or 6 propositions that Leibniz has. Or if this is merely a way of ideating about heaven, which I assume would be the city of God here, and talking about its correspondence, parallelism with what we have on Earth, and if that is some sort of, are we supposed to see some sort of pre-established harmony there as well between bodies and like between bodies and minds? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I love that in this last section, there's a tension within Leibniz between this purely rationalist metaphysics and something that's much, I think, closer to Neoplatonism.
Interesting, yeah.
And therefore more emanationist rather than rationalist. That in 83, right, he says, while souls in general are living mirrors or images of the universe of created things, spirits, so these would be monads like us, rational monads, right? They are images of the deity himself, the author of nature. They are capable of knowing the system of the universe. So we are capable of reading the monadology and understanding it, which means that we can then imitate certain features of it by means of artificial models. So we can understand the monadology, which presumably is the true system of metaphysics. But by understanding it, we can build in our own sphere something like a kind of demiurgic copy of the monadology, which presumably would be the European imperial state or something like that for Leibniz, right? That we can create this kind of mini universe with its own laws, its own principles, its own hierarchies, because we can see the true plan, understand it, and then rebuild it in our own copy. And so we become like little gods. We become little architects of our own little mini cosmos.
Yeah. It is. I like each mind being like, I guess yours has spirit, and I know it's translated from the French, so obviously that's the word that Leibniz was using, esprit. I think our translation has mind, which is fine, but it says that last little phrase, each mind being like a little divinity in its own sphere. Yeah, I guess that's the interesting thing. Monads don't have windows, but they have mirrors, right? But that goes to your point about to your analogy of the film reel playing on the interior, right? The mirror here is Leibniz's way of showing that, which goes back to his interesting distinction between, and this came up last week, Coop, between perception and apperception, right? Which maybe we could spend a moment on. It seems like for Leibniz, he has to come up with this distinction between perception and apperception because he seems to indicate that Descartes only considers apperception to be the mode in which either thinking or feeling occurs. Hence, it's always accompanied by consciousness. At least that's what Leibniz seems to say, right? Whereas perceptions, and as we know, Coop, you and I have talked about it a lot with Leibniz's concept of little perceptions, each monad mirroring and perceiving the whole universe, yet only apperceiving a small amount of it distinctly. I suppose, perhaps, let me pull up the passage, but I'll pause for a second while I pull this up just so I can find his definition of perception and see if that does anything for us. Yeah, I think 19, if we wish to call quote unquote soul everything which has perceptions and appetites in the general sense. Oh shit, maybe he doesn't define perception there. Sorry.
I think if 14, he gives us...
Okay, take over, please. I'm sorry.
No problem. He says the passing, at least my translation might be a little bit different, the passing condition, which involves and represents a multiplicity in the unity, or in the simple substance, is nothing else than what is called perception. So I think it's very close to what someone like Whitehead is going to be, this kind of intrinsic synthetic event that it's not something that a monad does, but somehow it's what a monad is. Right? The monad is the synthetic bringing together of multiplicity in the unity of the representation. And the weird thing is, for Leibniz, dead cockroaches perceive.
Interesting.
And I just like, what do they perceive? What? Right. Thomas Nagel, what is it like to be a bat? I love
Yeah.
what is it like to be a dead cockroach?
Oh man. Now, would those perceptions be the modifications of the body as it decomposes? Would those be perceptions in Leibniz's sense?
I think somehow, according to pre-established harmony, it would have to correspond to body decomposition. But but to make sense in terms of his system, it has to be a unity.
Yeah.
So there is a cockroach soul,
Yeah.
and that cockroach soul is always synthesizing the multiplicity of the universe into a unity.
Yeah.
And that unity is going to be centered around the decomposing body of the cockroach, but it's not bounded by that body. Right? It's not the form of the body. It somehow is the kind of ruling principle of that body as a centration of the universe.
He gets at the very next paragraph. He says, the action of the internal principle which brings about the change or passage from one perception to another might be called appetition. It is true that the appetite cannot always completely reach the whole perception it aims for, but it always attains something of it, reaches new perceptions. I don't know if that's exactly tackles the question of what does the perception mean there, but does this go towards the explanation of this of appetition? It's interesting that only appeared, I could have sworn this term appeared more than once, but
it does show up again two things. One, Rocky's this synthetic principle of synthesizing the plurality or multiplicity into the unity, that would be perception. And that's a very, very interesting definition, right? And the appetition here, if we want to stretch ourselves a little bit, sounds like desire, right? And I think the only question there, maybe I shouldn't bring that up, but I do see that
And wonderfully, that coordination of appetition and perception looks a lot like signifying chains. Right? A perception can't come from nothing. It only comes from a previous perception, and it arises out of that previous perception through the appetite, through desire propels perception onto the next perception, which has to hit, right? It can't miss. It might not hit the target, but the kind of impulse that moves perception onto the next perception always succeeds in generating the next perception, and so on. Right? It seems like these signifying chains, if we can talk about them that way, can't ever begin and can't ever end.
Yeah, that is good. And again, I think that's why this question of the convergence and divergence of series makes sense, that Deleuze is interested in that in his most structuralist book, right? Logic of Sense. And this question of the compossibility and incompossibility of worlds being a eminently Leibnizian question. Yeah. And I guess that's the thing that to stick with your analogy, then God is the sort of master signifier, right? It stands outside the chain, but gives it its final cause, so to speak. Let's see. I guess there was some other points. I did want to return to something you brought up, Rocky, that maybe we didn't unpack, because there is a lot. I loved reading you brought it up with the microscope, that it being a recent invention in his time. And here it is, 67. Each portion of matter may be conceived as a garden full of plants and as a pond full of fish. But each branch of a plant, each limb of an animal, each drop of its humors is also such a garden or such a pond, right? So it's turtles all the way down, ponds full of fish all the way down, right? It's Leibniz as the master of the infinitely small shines through here. And I think this is why Deleuze puts Leibniz along with Hegel, right, as the thinker of the infinitely large. They are pushing representation past its organic form to what I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, he calls its orgiastic form, right? There's an orgiastic representation that we see in the teeming and swarming of these ponds. I'd feel bad if I'm misquoting this repetition, but I believe that's the phrase that Deleuze uses. And so we could think of the ponds full of fish all the way down on all scales, being an endless transfinite series of orgies is a kind of an interesting way of thinking about it.
Do you think that implies that these structures and organizational unities also necessarily go all the way up?
That's the interesting thing, right? That's why, as For Deleuze, Leibniz pushes it towards the infinitely small, but it's Hegel who's trying to take it to the infinitely large, right? And trying to conceive of this difference between a bad infinity and a good infinity, right? Or a true infinity. The bad infinity being the series of ones, and the true infinity sublating its limit from within. What do you have something here, Coop?
I was trying to remember what he said about aggregates, because he says here, and there must be simple, we already read this, but, and there must be simple substances because there are compounds. For the compound is nothing but an accumulation or aggregate of simples. But I feel like there was something else that kind of suggested that the monads don't quite resemble aggregates, or am I?
Right. No, this is a good point to bring up because this actually reminds me of.
I remember where it is in the text, but.
It reminds me of Rouillet's neo-finalism, right? Where he, in a certain sense, is a panpsychist that sees souls and everything, except for the fact that their aggregates are not forms, as he calls it. So Rouillet is, I believe, it doesn't he show up in the fold, right? Yeah, he does. And Deleuze, along with Whitehead, as Rocky brought out, Rouillet is one of the last, at that time, one of the last like great Leibnizian in the Leibnizian lineage. But
it's interesting too. I saw Rouillet. There was something where he talks about. Let's see if I can find this in my notes. When I was thinking about the egg, because he kind of points towards something that.
Oh, when he brings up the seed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's find that. That's good, and it's a good point. It goes back to the pre-formationist. Well, I think he even uses that term.
Here we go. And as every present state of a simple substance is naturally a consequence of its preceding state. That goes to the signifying chain thing too. But back to the text, in such a way that its present state is big with the future. And then I think there's a subsequent 74 philosophers have greatly puzzled about the origin of forms, entelechies, or souls. But today, when detailed studies of plants, insects, and animals have shown that the organic bodies of nature are never produced from chaos or from putrefaction or putrefaction, but always through seeds in which there was doubtless some pre-formation, it has been concluded that not only the organic body was already there before conception, but also that there was a soul in this body. In a word, it has been concluded that the animal itself was already there, and that by means of conception, this animal has merely made ready for a great transformation in order to become an animal of another kind. Even outside generation, something similar is observed when maggots become flies and caterpillars become butterflies.
Well, this is the embryo.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking of, right? Especially like that, the brain, like the egg being, I don't know, we shorthand will be smarter, right? The egg knows how to make a brain. The brain doesn't. I guess the brain technically knows in a way how to make an egg, but not in the same fashion.
Right. And the BWO is the egg. The universe is the egg, right? The world is an egg. So yeah, he's dipping into embryology. And so yeah, that's definitely
see here too is where I think it's like pushing me to think about this type of plane of immanence or plane of the virtual plane or something like that too, right? Because the sort of there is a prefiguration, perhaps, like the virtual is real, or what's the statement about the actual blah blah. We just went over it last week. I can't
real
remember.
Without being actual, ideal without being abstract. That's the Proustian formula that Deleuze constantly comes back to.
Does that resonate? It resonates for me with a little bit of this, and also his discussion of the plenum and kind of the way that the monads would be more of a plane than a series of points per se. But I don't know.
This is where I would let Rocky step in. I want to make sure that unless you're holding off, not because we're talking, I don't want to preclude you from the conversation.
Oh, no, not at all. No, I'm thinking.
Okay.
Another way, actually, that I got into Leibniz was mediating between Spinoza and Leibniz was a really fascinating philosopher, Anne Conway, right? Yeah, she was Anne Finch, and then she became Lady Anne Conway. And she was an influence on Leibniz. There's pretty good evidence that he actually got quite a bit of his conception of monads from her.
Oh, shit.
She was a fascinating person. She was friends with some of the Cambridge Platonists, especially Henry Moore. Basically wrote one book that was published after her death, The Principles of the Most Ancient and Most Modern Philosophy. That's a critique of Cartesianism. It looks a lot like the Leibnizian system. And she was influenced by this kind of crazy Christian Kabbalist, Francis Mercury von Helmont, who was also a close friend of Leibniz. So there's both this kind of Platonist revival that Leibniz is part of, but also linked very closely to it this kind of revival of and Christianization of Kabbalism. And one of the things that I find fascinating in Anne Conway is she has no problem with the idea of souls passing through various instantiations as different kinds of animals. So it's not exactly reincarnation, but it's basically what we would think of as a kind of cycle of reincarnation. Horses can become dogs, humans can become pigs, but rather than being reborn as, it's very much, as Leibniz is discussing it here, there is a soul, but that soul is connected with a body that can be radically transformed into a new type while retaining its identity as soul. And so I find it fascinating that at one point Leibniz explicitly rejects metempsychosis.
Yeah, in this text, correct?
Yeah, but he also says that the caterpillar becomes the butterfly.
Right.
And that's just one example of something that's happening much more generally. So I don't know what the real difference is between my soul being transferred to the body of a pig and my soul shrinking into some kind of seed that over a long period of time eventually becomes the body of a pig.
Right.
Those aren't conceptually, they're a little bit different, but at the end of the day, the outcome is the same. We have a picture of souls as passing through various incarnations of various types of animals. And then I think that the thing that I think Leibniz doesn't go as radically as Anne Conway because he wants to insist on this distinction between rational and merely animal monads.
Yes.
So that there's a threshold that gets crossed. So maybe once you get a rational monad or are a rational monad, maybe there are limits to what you can be transformed into.
Is this part of the Christianization you're talking about? So there's something a little less Christian determined in Anne's system, where transmigration, which sounds more like Hinduism, right, than Christian, and maybe Leibniz doesn't want to violate that principle of we're as humans made in God's image, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure.
And interestingly, the one thing that doesn't appear at all theologically in the monadology is anything like Christ.
Right.
And in Anne Conway's system, she actually identifies three substances or types of substance. There's creaturely substance, God, and then Christ is a third substance that is like creatures in that it can change, but is like God in that it's always good. So it's very kind of Deleuzian. Like Christ is this kind of vector or infinite velocity that only changes for the better. So the good is never exhausted. So Christ is just this kind of infinite power of always becoming better.
Yeah.
Always changing for the better, whereas the creatures sometimes become better, sometimes become worse, presumably just oscillate maybe in some kind of Hindu, like endless cycle of samsara sort of thing. But again, that's, I think, the interesting question for Leibniz is this ultimate advocacy for the best of all possible worlds that doesn't seem to have a kind of end state. So is the best of all possible worlds one in which we endlessly circulate through all the different types of being?
We're talking about eternal return or something like this.
Right. Is that compatible with what Leibniz is talking about? Could an infinitely wise, powerful, and good God enforce the kind of universe that would cause every monad to eternally return through all the other monad or through all the other experiences of every other monad?
Yeah, that's the clamor
return of difference. Yeah.
That's a Deleuzian Leibniz, right? But I don't know if it's quote unquote Leibniz's Leibniz.
Right. Yeah.
And Deleuze certainly wants to have his Leibniz and eat his Nietzsche too, right?
Yeah.
His whole move is to take the logical machinery of Leibniz and then say, all we need are these kind of sparks that go across incompossible worlds.
Yeah.
Which he thinks that's the Nietzschean will to power, basically.
Yeah.
Somehow making the incompossible actual. So I'm curious what you all think. Is that it's a nice move. It's a beautiful image. But sometimes I wonder if it does it even make sense. Like, what does it mean to talk about communication across incompossible worlds? It seems like it's a weird mixing of vocabulary, right? Because you're taking something that's logically impossible, but then saying it's metaphysically actual.
But it does seem to go with Deleuze's principles of creation, right? And Coop's you've been going back to this question of the plane of immanence, the virtual plane, and how Deleuze's interest in pure events, for example, right? There are these pure events that are without the proper circumstances are not actualizable, and there's always some remainder for furtherance. And so, yeah, I mean, that is the interesting aspect of Deleuze that reminds me a little bit of what you were saying with this third kind of Christ-like substance. Although I'm not sure Deleuze would ascribe the infinite perfectibility or goodness inherent in it, but he might. But on the other hand, his whole ethics of the event is not to be unworthy of what happened to us. And in that sense, that's a way of finding the best of all possible worlds, even in the wound that precedes me, that I was born to embody. Yeah, because Nietzsche says too, right? At least in one of the ways of telling the eternal return, right? The demon coming to you. And his whole point being, right, that if we think about reliving the highest of joys and exaltations an infinite number of times, of course we're going to celebrate. But then we know we have to live through all the shit that leads up to and follows from it. And that may cause a gnashing of teeth. But Nietzsche's point is you can't have one without the other, right? You can't choose merely the highest of highs without the lowest of lows. And I think that's this whole logic of convalescence, right? Health as a perspective on sickness and vice versa. So maybe I'm twisting myself in a pretzel here, trying to justify Leibniz's optimism, as I've called it. But it is interesting for me squaring like the Christianity of Leibniz's monadology with something like the Book of Job, where one of the lessons is basically trying to rationalize an inherent moral order to the universe is prideful and is a great way of being wretched. And obviously that's not the only lesson of Job, but I take away from it that trying to ascribe a moral order to the universe, whether good or evil, is arrogant beyond.
I've always found it problematic to talk about Leibniz's optimism.
Okay.
But that's not just your term. I think people have written on this idea, like even he's classified as somehow like a metaphysical optimist, which I guess if you think optimism in the sense of optimal, it makes sense.
Of best, yes, gotcha.
Yeah, but when I hear the word optimism, I think of a kind of cheeriness.
You're right. I was using it loosely. You're right.
But what I think is fascinating about Leibniz is if you take him at his word, there's actually nothing cheery at all in the account that he's giving us, right?
Right. Okay.
It's terrifying. We look around, the world is shit, right? But this is the best.
Yep.
This is the best one that's possible. So this is deeply disappointing. In some sense, Schopenhauer agrees with Leibniz. Schopenhauer says this is the best of all possible worlds. It's just Schopenhauer gives it this melancholic tinge. It couldn't get any better. If will expresses itself in individuated beings, they're going to fight and kill each other. That's how it has to be. It's the best one possible. It's the same logic, right? To say that something is the best possible isn't to say that it's satisfying or good, right? It's not. In that sense, even though I think Leibniz himself sounds as if he's giving a moral judgment of the goodness of creation.
Yeah.
Logically speaking, it's just a claim about the inevitable conflicts between organizing principles and concrete particulars.
No, this is very good. And yes, I was thinking of optimism in my head in the sense of optima, right, of best. But I was also saying it loosely in the sense in which I was ascribing to Leibniz a cheery outlook when you're right. That assumption should be challenged. And it makes sense that Schopenhauer is a Leibnizian in that sense that you describe, Rocky, because his dissertation is on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. And we know that's a Leibnizian hallmark. So
yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that there might be some sense in which the principle of sufficient reason is at the heart of something deeply melancholic and even despairing, right? If everything that happens has a sufficient reason, then in some sense, there's no way out. There's no hope for something miraculous or ultimate. Maybe that's the kind of thing that drives this language of the messianic in a lot of post-structuralism or post-Heideggerian discourse. Is if we have to work within the principle of sufficient reason, then we're just stuck.
And I would say that I think I was going towards something like this with the Busquet quote that Deleuze likes. My wound preceded me. I was born to embody it. That's sufficient reason, right? That's the melancholic aspect. But also there's something liberating in a certain sense of not being unworthy of what happens to us, right? Of rejecting reactive forces that can tinge us to resentment and resignation. Coop, were you about to say something? I apologize.
Yeah, I was going to ask how this relates to something like Hegel with the rational is actual and the actual is rational, and how that would extend to the principle of sufficient reason. I don't know. I don't know that I could carry that all the way through, but I'm just curious as far as Rocky's commentary.
And I would add,
if that would have any resonance or without, I don't know. It feels like it's similar sort of thing, but I don't know.
I've also read the word actual there translated as real. The real is the rational.
Yeah, the real is rational and the rational is the real. Yeah.
I only said that because of our distinction earlier, the Deleuzean distinction, right? That the virtual and the actual coincide. They're both real. So anyway, just 2 cents. Wasn't trying to correct you, just thinking out loud.
It seems to me that at least one important difference is that Hegel wants to put freedom front and center as the essence of spirit. So spirit will be nothing if it's not free. It's just that the realization of freedom is a kind of logical problem because it has to be rational. But what he wants is rational freedom that's ultimately expressed as some kind of historical expression through the form of the state and culture of this kind of absolute spirit. And I think in Leibniz, I would be interested in what you guys think, but I don't think there's much room for individual freedom. The monad is determined. The monad is what it is. It's going to do what it's going to do. But Caesar is going to cross the Rubicon.
Right.
And of course, the whole question of free will is this kind of interesting, tricky one where there are certainly coherent ways where you can say Caesar is free, even though God's foreknowledge can tell that he's going to do it. Right. So it could be the case that the monad is going to do what it's going to do and nonetheless is free. But that always struck me as a kind of a thin, that seems like a thin kind of freedom that's unlike the kind of freedom that Hegel wants to introduce in this more kind of bourgeois modern mode, where, I think Leibniz is more this kind of more Neoplatonic. We are oriented towards a relatively fixed model of the good rather than constructing through our own autonomy an enlightenment condition of human freedom. Right.
This is fantastic. Coop and I, it's been a while, Coop, but we did the first part of
Philosophy of Right.
The Philosophy of Right, and looking at the seeds being planted of what you were saying, Rocky. Obviously, you might have been thinking of the phenomenology or the science of logic, but there too, the historically determined evolution of freedom is at front and center in the Philosophy of Right. But yeah, you're right. With Leibniz, it is interesting that this again is part of something interesting where, to bring in Deleuze for a moment, if the monad is immune to extrinsic causes and has its own internal principle, which is also called active force, in which it changes and evolves and has a certain fluidity. For Deleuze, right, if we consider the monad, at least in part, or can't say in part because it has no parts, but at least minds as monads, for Deleuze, we know that thinking is not something that happens based on will, based on voluntary action. It is an external force, a problem in the world that forces us to think. It's a shock to thought. It's a no shock, as he calls it in the cinema books, right? And so in that sense, we are constrained, and yet the freedom comes in our elaboration of the problem, in our determination of the problem, and we have the solutions we deserve based on that determination. So I do wonder with Leibniz about that kind of, perhaps if we were to force his hand, he might end up closer to Hegel than not through the acceptance of a rational freedom. Now, on the other hand, it's uncertain, because the only thing that seems to be allowing for a possibility of freedom is the truths of contingency, right? The truths of fact, which allow for certain possibilities and disallow others. And I wonder there, if, Coop, you were on the money bringing up Mayasu earlier, with contingency being the only necessity. Now, that obviously doesn't square with Leibniz's definition of God, unless we maybe do a little bit of rearranging of the furniture ideationally in order to square that. I will say, we have been at it for an hour and a half. Do we want any concluding remarks before giving Rocky the floor to tell us more about? It hasn't been that long since you were on to talk to us about your book, and you could tell us a little bit more about the sequel you have planned. But if there any concluding thoughts? Speak now or forever hold your monads.
Forever hold your monads.
I was going to say
keep my
peace.
monads in my pockets.
I was going to say forever hold your peace, but then I thought peace and the pun on peace, and there's no pieces, there's no parts.
So,
anyway,
I'm curious to hear from the two of you what led you. Were you led to Leibniz through Deleuze? Were you looking at the fold and Deleuze, or was it something else?
I think it was like micropolitics and segmentarity, but even the Plateau prior to that one, which I forget, was suggesting like the differential calculus metaphor for something like molar and molecular, and the way that the lines cut and intersect, and the infinitesimal, or the petite perceptions as it pertains to micropolitics, right? I think that was a trajectory that got us here. But I don't know. I've always had these bizarre theories about Leibniz and the body without organs and zones of intensity, and monads having some type of either like a reverse relationship, or like having some type of that being a jumping off point for Deleuze with regard to the body without organs.
And I will say you've always been interested in the paintings of Leibniz with the beautiful wig. But also, I think in the discussion of Gabriel Tard in that Plateau, if I remember correctly, he's described as a Leibnizian, if I remember.
Yeah, because it deals with the micro-sociology.
Yeah, and
that was definitely a jumping off point.
Does he call him a Leibnizian here, or am I maybe I'm thinking of the fold? Infinitesimal imitation, opposition, and invention are therefore like flow quantum, marking a proper propagation, binarization, or conjugation of beliefs and desires. So the infinitesimal there, I know it's just as an adjective, but yeah, I suppose I know that I don't think he calls him a Leibnizian here, so maybe I just misremembered that. But in any case, yeah, it definitely it's something that has interested Coop for a long time, and we talked about Leibniz and the infinitesimal last time, and I told him, I was like, hey, why don't we read the Monadology, right? It's short, it's a short text, but it's full of it's full of ponds of fish all the way down. And Rocky, I knew you'd be an excellent interlocutor for that reason.
Even this first sentence here, this to me suggested something to do with body without organs. Maybe it is a surface level reading, but the monad about which we all speak here is nothing other than a simple substance which enters into compounds, simple meaning without parts. And I suppose, right, what do? You make yourself a body without organs, which I think implies a construction. If you're using Spinoza to come into relation with other bodies, etc., I think there's something there. Maybe it's just some shared thread between Spinoza and Leibniz. So I don't know if you have anything there, but I have a left field question or something I could pose if there's no juice on that.
One thing to at least say to Rocky is I wonder about this translation of number 3, monads are the true atoms of nature, because we know the word atom from the Greek means that which cannot be divided, subdivided, cannot be cut. And maybe he does use that literal word in his French. Maybe that's a translation issue. I don't know. But atom would not be a monad because atoms wouldn't go all the way down, right? They wouldn't be infinitely subdividable. So.
I think the emphasis there is on true. It's a critical
point.
Right? These are the atoms.
Okay. Gotcha. Good point. And I'll let you respond to Coop about BWO. I didn't mean to interrupt that question, Coop. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to me because on the one hand, it seems like Leibniz remains entirely within the sphere of representation, that a monad is nothing but a theater of representation. And so you would expect Deleuze to attack him with the same vehemence that he attacks Kant, but he doesn't. And I'm not sure why, except that maybe that because the conception of the monad as a kind of differential series of representations, perceptions, is completely independent of the actions of bodies, and yet happens to be parallel because of God's free choice. It's as if Leibniz, by eliminating the body from representation, maybe allows for a notion of the body that is free from representation. I've always found the concept of the body without organs hard to understand. I think it's a wonderful, there's a power to the concept, but like Leibniz and the monad, I have a hard time knowing what exactly is going on. It seems to me the body without organs is somehow akin to Leibniz's metaphysical continuum. But I think one of the things that Leibniz is doing is he's in developing the differential and integral calculus through a certain analytic notion of continuity. He's providing a purely mathematical understanding of the continuum, which interestingly involved infinitesimals, which fall away, but later become vindicated in the 20th century with Abraham Robinson. So there's a totally rigorous way of doing calculus with infinitesimal quantities. So Leibniz mathematically was fine, but the metaphysical continuum is related to the mathematical, but is something more. And that something more, like what is more in the continuum of the body than the continuum that mathematics gives us, which is certainly powerful enough to model physics, pretty much anything you would want to talk about, at least up to maybe quantum mechanics. So here's this incredibly powerful mathematical engine of representation of matter, but metaphysically, what's the remainder? What is the physical mathematical representation of matter unable to capture? It's this kind of pulsating desire body, which is meant to be expressed by the body without organs.
And Coop, you said you had a question from left field.
Oh, no, I don't know if it's too crackpot. I'll leave it for another time.
I want to hear it. I love crackpot.
I was wondering, I don't know, maybe it's just the discussion of the wave and the petite perceptions that comprise the wave for Leibniz, and Laruelle's mention of the wave, and I don't know, there's something to do with like the quanta and flows and that sort of thing, having some sort of resonance with Laruelle, but obviously I'm well above my skis there, but I don't know if that's, again, not really a question, but I don't know. It had me thinking about Laruelle with reference to the wave and quantum physics or mechanics or whatever the fuck he talks about.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure how Laruelle would plug in exactly, but I do think something that springs to mind for me is something that I think Leibniz himself wouldn't have known about, but if he learned of it, he wouldn't have been surprised. It only emerged, I think, in the 19th century, which was the rigorous description of mathematical functions that are continuous everywhere, but differentiable nowhere. So like intuitively, if you would think of it, think of like a fractal, a curve, a wave structure that's so wavy that as you keep zooming in on it, the wave never becomes flat. You zoom in on the crest of the wave, and as you zoom in, it becomes even wave, it has like little waves as part of it, little waveforms. And then you zoom in on the crest of one of those little waveforms, and it too is wavy. So a little bit like Leibniz's idea of ponds inside ponds inside
right.
ponds.
Or just infinite folds within the monad itself.
Right. If you have a mathematical curve that is literally infinitely folded, in the sense that you can never isolate a fold, zoom in on it, and convert that fold into something that approximates a line. If it's folds all the way down, which can eventually be mathematically expressed. Again, I think it was in the 19th century, someone came out with a way to formalize this. But who was really excited about this discovery or invention within mathematics? Gershom Scholem and Walter Benjamin. And they exchanged a bunch of letters about this because they, thinking in terms of Kabbalah and Messianism, were excited about the image of something that would be temporal. They took this purely mathematical structure and said, if we think of time as being kind of something like expressed by the mathematical continuous function, then you have an image of time in which time is always flowing, but has no direction. And so they were trying to reinterpret almost metaphorically this mathematical construction as a kind of expression of the idea of messianic transcendence. How could something be in time, but completely unrepresentable, right? There's no tangent to the curve. So there's no way to measure the slope of time, the slope of the curve at a point, right? There is no slope. It's non-differentiable. And yeah, I wonder if that would throw a wrench into Leibniz's kind of notion of continuity or smoothness. He certainly wants to think of a kind of fractal structure where, that things are, but I think he was always assuming that curves, if you zoomed in sufficiently, would always be differentiable. And yeah, maybe it goes back to this question of transcendence. If the monad is smooth and differentiable everywhere, then the signifying chain of perceptions has a kind of logic to it. But if the signifying chain of perceptions is more like a continuous but non-differentiable curve, then maybe there isn't an answer to the question which perception is coming next. That there might be some kind of indeterminacy, that the monad could be complete but not determined sequentially in the way that Leibniz.
Yeah, I think that might articulate. I think really what I was trying to think is trying to squeeze into some kind of thinker of radical immanence, perhaps in that way. But I don't know. I'm not sure if I fully understand it. But my primitive understanding of jives with what you said with respect to time and not there being that indeterminacy outside of perception or whatever. I don't know. Forgive me.
No, I like that idea. And I like the idea something like what would applied Leibnizianism look like? What would if you got a team of monks and nuns and started some kind of community to meditate every day on the essence of the monad? What would that be? What would entering into your monadhood, presumably trying to maximize clear perceptions? Like what would happen? Could there be a Leibnizian Buddha who actually becomes a divinity by establishing a kind of maximal clarity of perception?
That would be kind of like the Measu God to come. Here's what I think the germ of it was like, thinking about the monads as infinitely differentiating within themselves, but not being determined by other monads, suggested some type of radical immanence at play or something like that. But I don't know if you guys can follow what I'm saying or if it makes much sense. But yeah, I think what I was getting at. Of course, that kind of flies in the face of compossibility and contingency, the absolutism of contingency or whatever, because that sort of implies a causal chain, or I would guess it could be determined at the last instance as far as contingency is taken, though. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting because there is a kind of profound solipsism in Leibniz, right? Every monad is a solipsistic universe, and it just happens to be the case in some sense, like luckily enough, there is a God to coordinate all these monads so that their representations cohere with one another. But from the kind of inner point of view of the monad itself, there's no real reason to distinguish your experience as a monad from among infinitely other monads coordinated with you, and the same isolated monad where there are no other monads, right? Like qualitatively, there would be no difference. And I think that seems to me to be close in spirit somehow to Laruelle, to think of the kind of indifference of radical immanence and some kind of acosmism, right? That there are certain questions about what's really going on that just dissolve, right? That just completely dissolve under their own weight.
I love that you can roll with this. I was excited. I was excited when Taylor said he had invited you for this discussion because you're one of the few people that I've encountered that, there's been a handful, but I think you rolled the best with some of my, I don't even know what you would call it, some of my very highly speculative gibberish that I come up with.
I don't think it's gibberish. No, that's. I think it's an underappreciated aspect of philosophy, that there's an imaginative, creative, speculative moment in philosophical communities that's often covered over by this kind of like sad professionalist bourgeois need to prove oneself and, I don't know, maintain some pretense of mastery and so forth. Those things are fine, but they're always fed by the wild flights of imagination. And so why not own up to that and enjoy them, right? And
absolutely. I totally agree. I think you don't give yourself enough credit, buddy. Rocky, just as we always want to be able to do, we like to give the last word to promote and talk about the projects you're working on. So please, you can tell us again about the forthcoming book. I think we've described it as a sequel. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you had in mind, but tell us about the book you're crafting and any other projects you may be working on.
Sure, yeah. Right now, Gianluca, Caterina, and Fernando Tomei and I are wrapping up our book on autopoiesis. So that is very close to being done. We're making final tweaks, and fingers crossed, we'll be able to submit that to Springer by like the end of the month. So that has been a real haul, pulling that thing together, and it's been fun, but it's also reached the stage where I think all three of us just want to get it out of our hands and heads. And then when that's off my plate, I'll have the chance to really turn to the next book, which is the sequel to Diagrammatic Immanence. It'll be Semiotic Immanence. And yeah, I guess in a nutshell, the argument of that book is that Peirce's triadic semiotics serves as a platform within philosophy to think metaphysical immanence coherently. And in a lot of ways, it's funny. When you think about something, you tend to see it everywhere. But going through the Monadology, I kept seeing Peirce everywhere. And Peirce was very influenced by Leibniz. In a number of places, he talks about how he sees Leibniz as one of the 3 or 4 great logicians, of which I think Peirce includes himself. Peirce says something like, there have been 4 great logicians: Aristotle, Leibniz. I think he includes Kant, weirdly enough, and then he says, and me. But the semiotics is a way to encompass both problems of representation and practical problems of immanent performance. And I'm convinced that it's only Peirce's triadic semiotics that can really both explain a metaphysics of immanence and then, without contradicting itself, account for its own ability to represent the immanence that it's describing, to both be immanent and describe immanence. And then the kind of upshot is to say that the mathematics of category theory is the right way to formalize Peirce's triadic semiotics, to make this integration of representation and immanence rigorous or thinkable to the ground. But yeah, that certainly is a work in inception. It would be nice. It'd be nice if it was reaching its conclusion. I think it's supposed to be almost done in terms of the contract, but like many things in academic work, the deadline has turned out to be more flexible.
Gotcha. Yeah, this is good. I'm glad to hear more about your work. And obviously we had fun when you came on to talk to us about eigenforms, when you came on to talk to us about diagrammatic immanence. As I said, whenever you get a manuscript ready, or even before, if you want to talk about some of these things, we would love to have you back on.
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking with you guys, and I love the podcast format. I think it's a really interesting way to do philosophy, right? There's a ritual character to it. It's philosophical, but it's also bounded. I find it tremendously liberating, because this is the kind of thinking that I enjoy most. I really don't like writing. Writing is the grind. This is the fun part.
Yeah.
But it's not just the fun that you have over a couple of beers at the bar. There's a kind of structure and ritual to it, and I really appreciate that side of it as well. So I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and yeah, I think this is a great platform for real thinking.
I very much appreciate that.
I gotta thank Coop for keeping it going. He's the machine that keeps it going, and I'm just here along for the ride. And I'm just glad also that I was able to introduce both of you, because it is nice when we have guests on that leave an impact and really strike up some really good conversation. So I want to thank you again for coming on short notice, because I know I didn't give you that long, but thankfully the text wasn't long. And,
right.
And thanks again for being with us today, Rocky. And we'll be in touch. Probably, Coop, do you think next week?
Yeah, it should be out. I dropped the last one on Friday night just because it had been a couple of weeks. I'll have this probably out by next Monday night at the latest.
Okay.
That's the plan, at least.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great.
I always enjoy having you. But that will wrap up this edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We'll see y'all next week.
The rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure bias without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. violent because what happens there is the murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.